I want to talk about the idea of culture, looping back to some things that we were talking about before. The idea of culture has been perhaps, as I said, anthropology's biggest success in the world, the thing that we most launched out there. And if we now, everybody talks about culture all the time. Back 100 years ago, this would have been a little used word. It was not a very common word. It was not a very common idea. Now it is. And we talked about in the last class how culture was launched against ideas of racial determinism, against ideas of natural, environmental, or geographic determinism. And it really is best when culture is seen as something that can be used as anti-ethnocentric, as anti-deterministic, and as a way to, in general, that we understand that culture is what explains human differences and is the way that we become particular human beings. It's the way that we become human in general. And so this idea is what some anthropologists call culture with a capital C, which is to say the big idea of culture and how it should be seen and used. However, there's always lurking the idea then, well, everyone has their own separate culture. And this is when cultures becomes plural, and we start trying to map out or determine where one society starts and ends, and we start trying to determine the patterns of different kinds of societies. And it's at this point that we can get into trouble. And it's not to say that people don't have patterns, but in some ways you have to be careful about when you look at other societies and say, aha, I'm going to try and find out their culture, or I'm going to practice cultural relativism. You have to watch out for some issues that can come up. So I'm going to go through 5 points about what I think we should understand culture as opposed to some of the ways that it has been used or maybe misused that are less helpful. So the first point is that cultural relativism is a way that we understand other people, that we try to get into their worlds, that we try to understand how people are making the decisions that they are making. It does not mean that we're going to approve of everything that anyone is doing, nor should people approve of all the things that we are doing. We should use it as a way to be critical of our own society and sometimes critical of other societies. And so we should not confuse this with a kind of moral relativism or in everything, all cultures are great. It doesn't help us in that way. It's also not an easy thing to do. It's something that you have to arrive at by actually participating in and talking to people. So it's not something, a lot of people think that we can just kind of adjust our attitudes and we'll be fine. It actually, when you are confronted with deep cultural difference, it becomes much more difficult to try and understand people in their own framework. And I think that's why as soon as Muckle, González, and Camp bring up cultural relativism, they also talk about cultural practices that are adaptive and maladaptive. That is to say, things that people do which may be beneficial within a certain society, but other practices which might be harmful to members of that society. Now, as we saw in biological evolution, these terms, adaptive and maladaptive, are always a little bit tricky. You always have to wonder, well, who's measuring this and maladaptive at what time and for whom? But it does tell us that we don't want to just say, oh, anything goes or everything is acceptable in another society or in our own society. There are practices in every society which we might wonder if they might be culturally sanctioned by tradition, but they might not necessarily be good for the members of society who are subjected to them. So we have to be careful of not using cultural relativism as an excuse to let ourselves off the hook for driving big SUVs around just because we want to be independent of other people. It might be maladaptive. And the second point is that all societies, all cultures, all groups are going to have different opinions within them. They're all going to be variable, or what Muckle, González, and Kemp call heterogeneous. There's going to be different elements within them. As we talked about with dependence and independence training, this often means that there's a kind of continuum. There are some people who, are way into what we might call dependence training and are really inculcating values of socialization and their children, and others that are very into independence training. But this often occurs along a continuum in any society, and there's going to be different points of view and people that object entirely. And so that is in opposition to the view that the societies or cultures come as homogeneous, or places where everyone is the same. Muckle, González, and Kemp say that some societies are more homogeneous than others, and I guess that may be true, but it's actually very difficult to measure homogeneity in any absolute sense. There are many times in the world when people who from the outside look entirely the same will claim from the inside that they are so different that they should be fighting each other all the time. And so, some of the things that are called ethnic conflicts in the world are between peoples who share more cultural markers than any other people in the world. If you think about, say, the conflicts between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants, they were almost, from an outsider point of view, would seem completely absurd that they were claiming to be so different from each other. Again, people can claim to be different and they can claim to be the same, and those claims are part of a person's society. So it's difficult to measure homogeneity. I would just like to stick with the idea that all societies are going to have different points of view and different people who have different things to say about what's going on in their own society. The third point is that culture borrows from others. We interact with others. We think about, we take terms from neighboring languages and appropriate them for our own. And so when we are doing culture, we are actually interacting with other people, and we may decide we're rejecting the ideas, customs of those that are next to us, but we're often appropriating them or using them in different ways. And so it's actually very difficult to draw a boundary around where one society begins and where one society ends. And every time that we try to put up borders and walls, people just end up doing what they always do, which is migrating and walking and interacting across those barriers that we try to erect. And any society that has been truly isolated from other societies tends to not do very well. They tend to wither and die out because people need to trade and interact with the wider world. So as we talked about with the spread of Homo sapiens throughout the world, it was always done on interacting and trading and being together and borrowing from each other. Bless you. Culture is always changing. It's something that is in each generation, as much as we may try to pass on traditions, people are going to be reworking those, thinking about them, and they should. And it's dynamic, and it involves people thinking and changing and using symbols to manipulate their world and coming up with new ideas. And this happens in our society and happens in other societies as well. And so we have to be careful of trying to, or thinking that other people are imprisoned in their static traditions, that they don't change, that it's been this way forever and ever. People are often changing, and it's often difficult to remember because humans have short memory spans. It's often difficult to go back more than 3 or 4 generations, but in all societies, things were going to be different. And so we don't want culture to become another form of determinism, which is to say that the idea that you can't escape the shaping of your culture, and that explains everything about you. So, yes, the idea that those people, well, they don't work as they work harder than us because that's their culture. And so, like I said, there's going to be variability within any culture, and there's always going to be people that are shaping and trying to think about culture from the inside. One of the people who a lot of social scientists draw upon for how people change and come up with their own ideas put it back in 1852. We would hopefully say humans or people today, but in 1852, this person wrote, men make their own history. So what he was trying to say was that people are creators of their own culture and history. We're active people in doing what we're doing. But they do not make it just as they please. So we don't get to choose the circumstances in which we make our own history, and we always have to be doing it together with the people around us. So we don't just get to do whatever we want because other people are going to be doing other things and other people have shaped us. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves. So, you didn't choose to be born where you were, and you didn't choose your circumstances. That's something that you have to deal with as you are trying to make your own history. But under circumstances directly found, given, and transmitted from the past. And so what this person who, like I said, a lot of social scientists find this quote to be a good description of how people are active trying to change the structures of their lives, but we did not choose our own circumstances. Those circumstances come to us from past inheritances, and I would add the circumstances of the things that other people are doing around you. This quote, of course, is by a person who underlies many of the social sciences, or as someone who a lot of people think about when they're thinking about how to understand humans. This is from Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is, of course, Karl Marx is most famous for his Communist Manifesto and revolutionary writings. This was a time that was after that, when he was trying to reflect upon why people had basically elected Bonaparte, some relation to the original Napoleon, back into office, and why they hadn't followed through on the revolutionary, the revolution that seemed to be happening. And this was one of the ways in which he thought about, okay, people are making their own history, but they can't, the circumstances under which they make it have been given to them. So this is Marx in his more reflective mode when he wasn't able to carry out the revolution that he believed was about to arrive. So that brings us to our fifth point, as long as we're talking about Marx and power and inequality and the people who have tried to address that, is that culture is also something that includes our attention to power and access to resources within it. So I think Muckle and González and Camp talk about this in terms of adaptive and maladaptive, in terms of how people have different abilities to shape culture, and some things that happen within a culture can have unequal effects on people within it. Like I said, I don't know. Sometimes I think we probably just need to use the words power and inequality, because culture should not be an excuse or a justification for why some people aren't able to fulfill their opportunities or end up in maladaptive situations. And the example that I would like to propose goes back to the article by Meredith Small. It's an example by Tronick called Doctor's Orders. And what he says is that he says, I know I have helped medical residents broaden their views when their lectures on good mothering are replaced by such comments as, what a gorgeous baby. I can't imagine how you manage both work and 3 others at home. And you're like, okay, great. I mean, yes, I totally agree. People should not be lectured on mothering and parenting practices if they don't have alternatives. And there may be cases in which there are cultural ideas about who is allowed to take care of kids, and it's fine to have a 12-year-old take care of a 7-year-old. That is great. However, it could be that the woman here, the mother, says, well, screw you, man. I would really like to have some childcare, but I can't afford it. So you know what? It's not my culture. It's that I have no access to affordable childcare and I can't get there. So, you know, can you help me with that? I mean, yes, spare me the lectures. Don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean we go back into lecture mode, but let's not say that people are just doing fine because of their culture and, oh yeah, you can leave your kids with a 7-year-old and that's just their culture. They'll be great. Not always. Sometimes it just means they would like to have it different, but they can't. So here's the question for you. And this is the reason why I've said all the things I've said. Let us say that you are talking about another group and you use a term like ethnicity, which sometimes Muckle and González and Camp encourage us to use, or you use a term like culture. And when you talk about that group, you talk about a group and you think of them as basically all being the same, as homogeneous. And you think about them as being this bounded group with, you know, all the people in one group. They don't really mix with people from a different group because they're in that culture, or that's their ethnicity. And you think of that as, aha, the reason they have those childcare practices because of their culture. They can't really change that. They don't really think about it. That's just the way they are, and that's the way they're always going to be. And that becomes your justification for why we don't need to have things like childcare or healthcare, because they're doing fine. That's their culture. They probably wouldn't accept it anyway. If you use a term, a cultural term, that is referring to another group of people that thinks of them as homogeneous, bounded, deterministic, and as justification for the ways in which people have been treating each other, what have you done? What term may you just be saying instead? What might this word be? what were we trying to get away from when we use the term culture? Yeah, Cass. Well, yeah, you're being ethnocentric, but what's the term for the thing that we use to talk about people as if they were all the same in their own category, they never mix, and that's determine their lives? Term culture was launched against, right? If you use a cultural term, you might as well be using a racial term, right? I mean, so, you know, one of the things that happened is people are like, okay, well, we're not going to use that word. We're not going to use that derogatory word. We're going to use this other word, which we're going to say, we're gonna call them European Americans now. And that will emphasize their cultural characteristics. But if culture is basically the same as what you thought about when you were wanting to use a racial term, you may as well just use the race term because it hasn't helped you. And so when we think about culture, if we really want to think about culture, we should think about people as being not all the same, heterogeneous, interacting with each other, constantly changing, and potentially as something that unequal conditions which should be addressed. So we don't want to let our cultural terms or our ethnic terms simply replace old ideas about race. And so, when we say, I mean, yes, in many cases, we don't want to use derogatory terms. But we also want to be conscious of the ideas about culture, which can lead to basically the same treatment as our old ideas.